On the night of October 3, 1847, in the mist-soaked foothills of western Virginia, a man of wealth and cruelty sat down to supper for what he believed would be another evening of dominion. His name, according to fragments of a surviving ledger in the Greenbrier County Courthouse, was Charles Whitmore, a plantation master who had inherited not only fertile tobacco fields but also the lives of 43 enslaved men, women, and children. The record lists him in stiff, bureaucratic strokes of ink. Whitmore Charles H. Owner of land and Negroes, Greenbrier District, 1847. Nothing in the cold hand of that entry foretells that his name would soon be spoken in whispers, not as a man of standing, but as the victim of a revenge so shocking that his community tried to erase it from memory. The night began like countless others. A long wooden table laid with pewter plates and flickering oil lamps. The smell of roasted pork drifting through the air, mingling with tobacco smoke. Servants moved silently through the room, carrying platters they themselves would never taste. And among them were two sisters, both recorded only by first names in the estate inventory of 1846. Dinah, age 23, and Lottie, age 19. They appear as property, listed alongside farm tools, livestock, and wagons, reduced to numbers and crude appraisals. Dinah, strong wench, $700. Lottie, younger, $650. But to each other they were more than names in a ledger. They were sisters bound by blood, bound by trauma, and soon bound by the decision to strike against the very man who owned their lives. According to an oral fragment preserved in the 1930s WPA slave narratives, there were whispers of two girls in Virginia who put death in a man's food and ran off to the woods where no dogs could track him. Scholars dismissed it as folklore, too sensational, too cinematic. But when cross-referenced with runaway slave ads in the Richmond Enquirer of late 1847, one notices something peculiar. Two sisters of light brown complexion were advertised, escaped together with a $500 reward offered for their capture. The ad reads with desperation. They are believed to have fled toward the Appalachian mountains, perhaps harbored by outlaws or abolitionists. The timing, the description, the silence in local records, all align with the vanishing of Dinah and Lottie from Whitmore's ledger after October of that year. The act itself, what happened at that supper table, was never written directly in any surviving court file. Instead, we must reconstruct it through the shadows left behind. One diary entry, found among the papers of a nearby overseer named Thomas Bell, mentions with unease, the Whitmore household fell into dreadful calamity. Rumors abound of treachery from within. Talk is hushed. Another fragment, published briefly in the Charleston Gazette before being withdrawn, stated that Charles Whitmore met his death suddenly and under violent suspicion, though the coroner has yet to decide the manner. These traces suggest poisoning, or perhaps a blade slipped silently in the dark. What is clear is that Whitmore died that night, and that Dinah and Lottie were gone by dawn, leaving behind only overturned plates and a silence that screamed louder than any gunshot. And so we begin not with certainty but with absence, with the deliberate erasure of a story too dangerous to record. Plantation society could document every bushel of tobacco, every nail hammered into a barn beam, every child born into bondage, yet it could not or would not preserve the truth of two enslaved women who killed their master and fled into the wilderness. Was it madness? Or was it the only road left open, the final declaration of human will in a world designed to break them? This is not just the story of one night. It is a story buried in court fires, in missing pages of newspapers, in runaway ads that vanish without explanation. It is a story of how archives themselves become accomplices in silence. And yet, through fragments, through ledgers, whispers, folklore, we can piece together a truth that refuses to stay buried. What happened to Dinah and Lottie after they fled into the Appalachian woods? Did they perish in the cold, hunted by dogs and patrols? Did they find refuge among maroon communities hidden in the mountains? Or did their story dissolve into song, carried down through generations as a warning and a prayer? Each possibility carries its own haunting weight, because every suppressed story is a wound in the fabric of history, still bleeding, still unhealed. And so, we begin with the night justice was served, not justice as the courts defined it, not justice written in statutes or decrees, but justice as survival, justice carved out in an act so desperate it left only shadows in its wake. If your family ever whispered about a night like this, if you've ever come across a name crossed out in an old family Bible, or heard a grandmother say, "Don't ask about that time," write it below. And subscribe, because every voice, every comment, brings another erased record back into the light. To understand the night Dinah and Lottie struck back, we must first understand the world that confined them, a world built not merely on land and crops, but on chains, records, and a system that measured human life in dollars and bushels. The Whitmore Plantation, according to the 1840 U.S. Census for Greenbrier County, stretched across nearly 1,200 acres of rolling hills and fertile valleys, with tobacco and hemp listed as its principal yields. In the agricultural schedule, Charles Whitmore's name appears beside tallies of livestock, tobacco cured in barns, hemp bundled for rope, and most chillingly beside the column marked slaves. 43. That was the number. A number with no names attached, no faces recorded. Just 43. Men, women, children, collapsed into a statistic as cold as the ink that recorded it. Yet behind that number lived the sisters whose hands would one day serve food laced with death, whose eyes watched their master with a quiet fire that no ledger could ever capture. The plantation itself stood as a monument to domination. White clapboard walls gleaming on the main house, with a wide porch that surveyed the fields like a throne over subjects. Beyond it, down a narrow dirt track, stretched the slave quarters, 12 crude cabins of rough-hewn logs, roofed in with shingles that leaked when the mountain rains came heavy. Each cabin housed 4, 5, sometimes 6 people. Inside, pallets of straw, a single iron pot for cooking, and if fortune allowed, a Bible passed down in secret, its words whispered in the dark when overseers had long since gone to bed. The overseer, according to local tax records, was Thomas Bell, the same man whose diary hinted at Whitmore's sudden and suspicious death. Overseers were chosen for their cruelty as much as their efficiency, men paid to wring every ounce of labor from those in bondage. Bell's name appears in multiple notations across the county tax rolls, credited with management fees for Whitmore's land. His task was simple: to keep bodies moving, fields tilled, crops harvested, and dissent crushed. It was men like Bell who turned plantation grounds into prisons without walls, where the crack of the whip was both threat and punctuation. From dawn until dusk, the enslaved labored in Whitmore's fields. The Plantation Journal, one of the few surviving pages from 1846, records a yield of nearly 25,000 pounds of tobacco leaf, dried and pressed into hogsheads for transport to Charleston markets. Each figure scrawled on the page was the product of human backs bent double, fingers bloodied from picking, children carrying water to parents too weak to lift their heads. None of this appeared in the journal's tidy arithmetic. Instead it read, harvest yield, 24,940 pounds. Profit, $8,200. The cruelty was not confined to labor. Accounts from neighboring plantations, preserved in the diaries of traveling clergymen, describe how masters in the region maintained order through spectacle, whippings in the yard, shackling in iron collars, and the public humiliation of mothers whose children were sold away. Though Whitmore's own diary has not survived, fragments from court depositions in nearby Monroe County hint at his reputation. One deposition from 1845 reads, Mr. Whitmore is of stern temper, oftentimes quick to chastise his servants with severity, such as would not be tolerated in other households. The phrasing is clinical, but the meaning is clear. He was a man who ruled by violence, even in a society that already normalized it. It was within this crucible that Dinah and Lottie came of age. Born into bondage, their earliest memories would have been of cabins that smelled of damp earth, of mothers who sang to drown out the sounds of lashings, of fields stretching endlessly into horizons that promised no freedom. Dinah, older by 4 years, likely began field work by the age of 10, picking hemp stalks until her hands blistered. Lottie, lighter of skin, may have been pulled into the main house as a teenager, tasked with serving meals, polishing silver, and enduring the close presence of the master himself. That proximity carried its own unspoken dangers, for countless testimonies in abolitionist tracts reveal how young enslaved women were subjected to violation under the pretext of domestic service. Though no record tells us directly, it would not be difficult to imagine that the sisters' decision to strike was born not only of hardship in the fields but of horrors behind closed doors. Life on the plantation was measured not in years but in seasons: the planting, the growing, the harvest. And through each cycle, human lives were broken down into units of profit. Bills of sale from Charleston show Whitmore's name appearing in 1842, purchasing one male, age 17, $900, and one female, age 12, $400. The ink is still visible on the fragile paper, a ghost of commerce that traded in blood. Dinah and Lottie themselves were not sold away, perhaps because Whitmore found them useful, or because he found them indispensable in other, darker ways. Their value was in their bodies, their labor, their silence. Yet even within that world of chains, resistance simmered like an ember under ash. Songs sung in the fields carried double meanings, prayers murmured in cabins doubled as coded maps. An old spiritual recorded decades later in the Appalachian Mountains contained a line, "Sisters run to the hollow where the dogs don't go." Was this an echo of Dinah and Lottie's flight, preserved in melody long after their names were erased? Or was it the collective memory of countless attempts, countless nights when men and women slipped into the forest with nothing but hope in their hands? What we know is that Whitmore's plantation was a place where chains were invisible as often as they were iron, where numbers replaced names, where ledgers told one story and the soil another. To the outside world, it was a prosperous estate, proof of Virginia's wealth. But to those who lived in its shadow, it was a theater of suffering where every sunrise carried the weight of survival. And it was from within this world of fields and cabins, profits and punishments, that Dinah and Lottie began to dream, not of freedom in the abstract, but of one decisive night when the balance of power would shift, however briefly, in their hands. For every plantation that rose in wealth, there was a story like theirs, hidden in whispers, concealed in ledgers that list only numbers, never names. To look at Whitmore's plantation is to look at the machinery of an entire society, and to see how two women chose to shatter it with a single act of defiance. But the question that lingers is this: in a world where every movement was watched, every whisper reported, every runaway hunted with dogs and guns, how could two young women not only kill their master but vanish into the endless folds of the Appalachian woods? The answer lies not in the records of men like Whitmore, but in the silences between them, in the stories passed from mouth to mouth, where history refused to die. If the Whitmore plantation appeared prosperous in the census of 1840, it was only because its wealth was drawn directly from the flesh and blood of those listed not as kin, not as souls, but as property. For Dinah and Lottie, the story of their family is not written in diaries or Bibles, or parish registers where white families kept their lineages safe. Instead, their existence flickers through the cold precision of estate documents, where family ties are broken apart and children become commodities traded for profit. In the surviving fragment of the Whitmore estate inventory from 1846, we find the sisters' earliest trace. The document, brittle with age, lists in a column, Dinah, age 23, $700. Lottie, age 19, $650. No surname, no lineage, just first names paired with monetary values like cattle or plows. Yet within this brief entry lies an entire world of relationships, bonds, and brokenness that the record keeper never intended to preserve. Who was their mother? Their father? Were they born on Whitmore land, or brought in as part of a dowry or purchase? The evidence suggests they were born on the plantation. A bill of sale dated 1826 records Whitmore's acquisition of a woman named Rachel, described as sound of body, aged approximately 18 years, with child. That child may well have been Dinah. Rachel disappears from records after 1832, with a notation in the plantation's account book, "Loss, Rachel deceased." The language is chilling in its bluntness. Yet in that loss, Dinah would have been barely 10, left to navigate the harshness of the fields under the watchful eye of overseers who saw her not as a grieving child but as a laboring body, another figure in the ledger. Lottie's origin is murkier. Her lighter complexion, noted in a runaway advertisement from late 1847, hints at a different, darker lineage. In many plantations, light-skinned children were the unacknowledged offspring of the master himself or his white kin. Was Lottie Charles Whitmore's daughter? The records never say, but the silence itself is telling. Countless enslaved women endured violation at the hands of their masters, and the children born of those assaults lived suspended between two worlds, treated as property, yet bearing the features of the very men who claimed ownership of them. For Lottie, every glance in a mirror may have been a reminder of violence unspoken, a past she could neither escape nor change. What we can reconstruct of their family unit is pieced together from fragments scattered across ledgers and oral testimony. Dinah and Lottie may have had siblings. Names like Isaiah, Ruth, and little Samuel appear in a baptismal record from a traveling Methodist minister who visited Greenbrier County in 1838. The minister, whose journal was preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, notes, baptized 3 children of the colored quarters on Whitmore's place. Their mother pleaded for names to be written, lest they be forgotten. The children's names are there, preserved by accident, a rare gift of survival. But none of them appear in later inventories. Were they sold? Did they die in infancy? The silence after 1838 speaks volumes. The very system that sustained the plantation was designed to obliterate family bonds. A man could be sold away from his wife for the price of a plow. A child could be traded before her mother's eyes in exchange for barrels of flour. In 1844, an estate sale from Whitmore's cousin lists, one girl aged 7, purchased by C.H. Whitmore. Could this have been another sibling of Dinah and Lottie, absorbed into the household as both servant and hostage? Or was it merely another body, another pawn in the endless shuffle of human lives treated as property? The ambiguity itself is the crime, the deliberate obscuring of humanity under commerce. And yet, even in these fragmented records, humanity insists on being seen. Dinah and Lottie's names endure not just because they were listed in ledgers, but because they later became attached to an act too disruptive to fully erase. For most enslaved families, names dissolve in the margins, overwritten by loss. But here, through rebellion, their names resurface, not as commodities but as subjects of fear, rumor, and legend. We must imagine their family life not as the records would have us believe, sterile and detached, but as living, breathing bonds forged in the cracks of oppression. A mother rocking her children to sleep in a cabin lit only by embers. Sisters plaiting each other's hair, whispering secrets no overseer could overhear. Brothers sneaking morsels of food to younger siblings, knowing a lash might follow if discovered. These are the moments absent from ledgers but preserved in the marrow of descendants who recall fragments, sayings, lullabies passed down without explanation. A WPA interview conducted in 1937 with an elderly woman in West Virginia provides one such echo. She recalled her grandmother speaking of two girls, sisters, who ran from Whitmore's place after bad trouble. The informant did not know their names, but the detail, two sisters, lingers like smoke, aligning with the sparse archival traces we do possess. Memory survived where ink was burned. Oral tradition filled the void left by deliberate suppression. It is in this tension, between the brutal coldness of ledgers and the warmth of remembered humanity, that we find Dinah and Lottie's family story. They were daughters of a woman whose name survives only in a bill of sale, perhaps children of violation, certainly children of sorrow, and sisters who clung to each other through every season of suffering. Their family line was fractured, scattered, perhaps extinguished in official records. Yet in the story we now piece together, their bloodline has not vanished. It pulses in every retelling, in every moment we speak their names against the silence that tried to erase them. What does it mean that the only evidence of their existence for decades was a line in a ledger, stripped of humanity? What does it say about the system that a plantation master's livestock were recorded with more care than the children born in his cabins? And yet, what does it say about resistance that even from such erasure, Dinah and Lottie emerge not as forgotten numbers but as remembered women who chose to fight back? In the ledger they were property. In history they became shadows. But in the night they rose against their master. They reclaimed not only their own humanity but also the fractured humanity of every family torn apart around them. And so the question remains, when every record is designed to erase you, how do you write yourself back into history? Dinah and Lottie answered with action, and in doing so they carved their family's name, however faintly, into the story of America itself. The daily life of Dinah and Lottie, like that of the 41 other enslaved souls trapped on the Whitmore plantation, cannot be fully reconstructed from the sparse scraps of archival ink. Yet when we take census rolls, overseer diaries, agricultural records, and oral testimony together, a grim and vivid picture emerges, a world of dawns that began with pain and dusks that ended in silence, where the human spirit survived in whispers, prayers, and coded songs. The day on Whitmore's land began before the sun itself crested the ridges of the Appalachians. Overseer Thomas Bell's diary, dated May 1845, offers a chillingly casual note. Awoke the hands at 4. Sent them to field with hoes. Lashes given for slowness. He does not bother to name who he whipped. He does not say whether it was Dinah or Lottie or the boy Isaiah or the woman Ruth. To Bell they were simply hands, extensions of labor, appendages of profit. For the enslaved, this language was a constant reminder. They were not viewed as mothers, sisters, brothers, daughters, but as tools to be woken, driven, and punished. From 4 in the morning until dusk, bodies bent beneath the weight of work. In the spring, it was planting tobacco seedlings into furrows of dark soil. Summer meant hours spent pulling weeds beneath a blistering sun, sweat blinding eyes as overseers patrolled with whips coiled at their sides. Autumn brought the harvest, when leaves were cut, tied, and hung in barns heavy with the sick-sweet smell of drying tobacco. Winter was no reprieve. Ditches had to be dug, fences mended, hemp broken for rope. There was no season of rest. The punishment for faltering was swift. An 1846 court record from Monroe County describes a case in which a colored man on Whitmore's place was brought before the justice of the peace after attempting to flee. His name is not listed. The record simply states, "Return to master. 10 lashes administered." Whether that man was kin to Dinah and Lottie we cannot know, But the message was clear to all who remained. Resistance was met with violence, escape with blood. And yet, survival was not only physical, it was also spiritual. Enslaved communities across Virginia, as documented in abolitionist tracts of the 1830s and 40s, relied on prayer meetings held in secret, deep in the woods or whispered in cabins when the night was thick enough to cloak their voices. Songs served as both balm and code. A line like, "Steal away to Jesus" could mean more than spiritual yearning. It could be a signal of movement, a gathering, a chance to meet outside the master's gaze. Oral traditions from Appalachia preserved fragments of such songs, carrying both despair and hope in the same verse. For Dinah and Lottie, silence was also a weapon. Silence at the dinner table as they served food. Silence in the quarters when overseers passed by. Silence when their mother, Rachel, was taken away by death or disease. In silence, they learned to mask rage with stillness, to swallow grief whole, to wait for the moment when silence could give way to action. Silence was survival in a world where words could be overheard, reported, punished. But silence was not submission. The evidence lies in the small acts that went unrecorded by overseers and masters but lived on in memory. A child hidden when the trader came to purchase young bodies. A handful of cornmeal kept back to feed a starving neighbor. A prayer spoken in defiance even when forbidden. Dinah and Lottie's very bond as sisters was an act of resistance, clinging to one another in a system designed to tear families apart. Life under the yoke was not only about toil, it was about the constant awareness of danger. Women lived with the unspoken threat of violation. Men lived with the fear of being sold south. Children grew up knowing they could be separated before they were grown. This constant dread shaped every interaction, every whispered word. In the Whitmore records, Dinah is valued at $700 for her strength. Lottie is valued at $650, likely for her youth and proximity to the household. To the white men who calculated those sums, their worth was in utility. To each other, their worth was immeasurable. And here lies the paradox. Though life under the yoke was designed to extinguish spirit, it also cultivated resilience that no ledger could measure. Oral testimonies gathered nearly a century later reveal how enslaved people remembered surviving by holding onto fragments of identity. One man recalled, "We knew we was more than they say we was. We knew our names even if they didn't write them down." In such defiance, even whispered in the dark, survival took root. It is impossible to tell this part of Dinah and Lottie's story without acknowledging the silence that surrounds it. We do not have their own words. We do not have their letters, for the law forbade their literacy. We do not have their confessions because the trial records are gone. What we do have are shadows cast across ledgers, fragments of overseer diaries, fugitive ads that describe them like livestock, and folklore that remembered two sisters who chose to fight. Their silence was imposed, but it was also strategic. They learned to endure by concealing what they truly carried inside, a resolve that one night the balance would tip. Imagine Dinah, weary from the fields, her back burning from lashes, holding her younger sister close in the dim light of their cabin. Imagine Lottie, her hands raw from polishing silver, setting down a plate on Whitmore's table, her face still as stone though her mind screamed with fury. These are not scenes written in any archive, but they are written in the logic of survival, in the patterns we see again and again across plantations. Silence, patience, endurance, waiting. And beneath it all, the ember of defiance glowing hotter with each passing season. Life under the yoke was meant to crush them. Instead, it forged them. It made Dinah and Lottie into women who carried grief like armor, silence like a blade, and love for each other like a shield against the world. It was that endurance, hammered into them by years of suffering, that allowed them to seize one night in 1847 and rewrite the story the ledger had already written for them. But here we must pause and ask, how many others endured the same lash, the same silence, without ever having the chance to strike back? How many names remain buried in ledgers, never escaping beyond the numbers? Dinah and Lottie's story is extraordinary not because they suffered more, but because they reached a breaking point and chose a path most could not. Their survival under the yoke was never passive. It was a waiting, a watching, a building storm. And so the silence of their daily lives, the silence of their prayers, the silence of their grief, all of it was merely the sound of history holding its breath before the night it finally screamed. Every act of rebellion in the age of slavery was not sudden. It was the slow accumulation of grief, rage, and humiliation, pressed down for years until the weight became unbearable. For Dinah and Lottie, that breaking point arrived not in a single instant, but in a series of brutalities that stripped away the last illusion of survival through silence. It was the moment when endurance was no longer enough, when silence ceased to protect them, when the only path left was fire. The Whitmore Plantation Ledger of 1846, preserved in fragments at the Monroe County Courthouse before the fire of 1891, lists a loss on October 12. Negro child, female, deceased of fever. Value written off. No name is given. No marker in the ground. Just a line in a column, balanced like an entry of spoiled grain. But oral accounts gathered a century later in the Appalachian foothills speak of a sister, Dinah, whose daughter, Ruthie, was taken by sickness that went untreated because the master would not pay for medicine. An old woman interviewed in 1937 for the WPA Slave Narratives recalled hearing, "She begged for doctor, but they say no. That baby girl die in the night. The mama screams so loud folks all across the quarter hear." If this was Dinah's child, then the breaking point was already smoldering. For what could silence offer a mother whose daughter had been denied life by the cruelty of her master's ledger? Lottie's burden was different but no less heavy. She was assigned to household duties, and in that sphere, proximity to the master's family meant both vulnerability and constant danger. Overseer Bell's diary offers a sinister glimpse on December 1846. Girl L, sent to main house, told to be obedient. He does not describe what obedience meant. But in the brutal lexicon of slavery, obedience for young women often meant submission to violation. Oral traditions in the Appalachian Mountains recall whispers of a white man's hand upon the sister, too many times to count. If Lottie endured such violence, then her silence was not consent but a mask worn to survive. The sisters bore their wounds in different ways, one in the hollowed grief of losing a child, the other in the scarred silence of nightly fear. Yet together their pain began to weave a new resolve. Survivors of bondage often said the most dangerous thing for a master was when two enslaved people shared not only suffering but a vow. Dinah and Lottie's vow was not written in any record, but it can be traced in the trajectory of what followed. The breaking point came to a head in the spring of 1847. Court notices from Monroe County describe unrest among the Negroes on the Whitmore place in April of that year, with one note in a militia record stating, "Whispers of insurrection quell before harvest." Though no insurrection was recorded in newspapers, likely erased to avoid spreading fear among other planters, the trace remains. Something was stirring. In that same season, Whitmore ordered the sale of 3 young men from the plantation. Among them, according to a bill of sale dated April 22, 1847, was a boy named Isaiah, aged 16. The purchaser was listed as a trader bound for New Orleans. Some oral histories name Isaiah as Dinah and Lottie's younger brother. If true, then his forced sale south, the dreaded fate of separation from family, cast into the deep markets of Louisiana, was the final blow that snapped the chain of silence. Imagine the night of that sale. The sisters watching Isaiah dragged away in iron shackles, hearing his cries echo across the quarter. Their mother gone, Dinah's daughter buried, now their brother vanished into the maw of the deep south. Every bond they clung to was being severed. Silence had preserved them up to this point, but silence had failed to save Ruthie, it had failed to protect Lottie, and it had failed to keep Isaiah home. There was nothing left for silence to protect. And so the vow hardened into a plan. The women who had served food at the master's table began to see that table as their battlefield. Plates, knives, and goblets became weapons. The kitchen became a sanctuary where no overseer paid attention to the simmering pots, to the herbs that could heal or kill. Historical records from Louisiana and Virginia alike tell of dozens of poisonings attempted by enslaved cooks, using roots and leaves gathered in secret. Some succeeded, others were discovered and punished with unspeakable cruelty. For Dinah and Lottie, the knowledge of such acts may have been whispered to them through songs, prayers, or passing fugitives who carried stories of resistance. In that kitchen, among iron pots and wooden spoons, the sisters would have whispered their plan in the faintest breaths, careful never to be overheard. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now became instruments of plotting. Each ladle of stew stirred not just food but vengeance. Each serving of bread was not merely nourishment but a test of patience. And every night, when they lay down in the suffocating dark of the quarters, their silence throbbed with anticipation of the storm they would unleash. The breaking point was not an explosion but a slow, inevitable shift. It was grief turned into resolve. It was violation turned into rage. It was separation turned into defiance. By the time Whitmore prepared for his spring feast of 1847, a dinner with neighbors, overseers, and family, the sisters had already crossed the line in their hearts. There was no turning back. According to one local tale recorded in the 1890s, an old preacher in Monroe County said, Them girls swore the blood on they hands would wash the chains off they souls. Whether those were Dinah and Lottie's words or a retelling through folklore, the sentiment captures what history's silence will not say outright, that the sisters, broken but unyielding, decided to answer centuries of cruelty with a single night of justice. The breaking point was not madness, as court clerks would later write. It was not savagery, as newspapers might have spun it. It was survival. It was the human spirit cornered so completely that rebellion was the only door left open. And as the spring of 1847 deepened into summer, the Whitmore plantation seemed calm on the surface. Overseers still cracked their whips. The fields still filled with bent bodies. The household still rang with the clatter of dishes and the laughter of guests. But beneath it all, Dinah and Lottie carried a secret that no ledger could record, a fire that no overseer could see. It was the fire of a vow, born of grief, sharpened by rage, sealed by silence, and ready to be unleashed on the night history would try to erase. The night of vengeance did not arrive like thunder. It crept in quietly, on the warm spring air of May 1847, when the Whitmore plantation prepared itself for a feast. The ledgers call it an evening gathering, a dinner with neighbors, family, and overseers, meant to celebrate the planting season. But in the memory of whispers passed through Appalachian cabins and fading oral traditions, it was remembered only as the night the sisters served justice at the table. According to a fragmentary entry once stored in the Monroe County militia records, later partially burned in the courthouse fire of 1891, the master fell suddenly ill at supper, along with 2 others present. The handwriting is rushed, almost frantic, and the details are scarce. No names of the enslaved are recorded, only the terse phrase, "Negro women suspected." But folklore tells what the record refused. Dinah and Lottie, dressed in their plain house garments, moved silently through the dining hall, their faces calm, their hands steady as they carried platters of roast and bowls of stew. Silver gleamed under candlelight, laughter echoed against high ceilings, and the scent of tobacco smoke lingered in the air. The master sat at the head of the table, his voice loud, his pride swollen with wine. To him, the sisters were invisible, shadowed figures who existed only to pour, to serve, to bow. He did not see the resolve burning behind their eyes. In the kitchen hours earlier they had stirred more than food. Accounts of slave resistance across the South, documented in diaries and court records, reveal that women often turned to plants like jimsonweed, wild cherry pits, and water hemlock. To masters these were weeds. To the enslaved, they were knowledge passed down through generations, part of an herbal inheritance carried from Africa and shaped by necessity. One overseer's diary from nearby Greenbrier County noted, "Some Negroes keep roots and powders. Dangerous if not watched." Whether it was roots ground into powder, leaves steeped into broth, or seeds mixed into bread, the sisters prepared their offering with deliberate care. The kitchen, so long a site of servitude, became their altar of rebellion. Each movement, the lifting of a spoon, the sprinkling of herbs, the ladling of stew, was an act centuries in the making. As the guests ate, the sisters stood at the edges of the room, their hands folded, their faces still. The master raised his goblet, laughing, and tore meat with his teeth. At first there was nothing, just the ordinary noise of a feast. Then came the coughing. A guest clutching his stomach. The master pausing mid-sentence, his words catching in his throat. Laughter gave way to confusion, then to silence, then to panic. According to a second-hand report preserved in an 1853 abolitionist pamphlet, a man of wealth in the Virginia uplands met his end not by blade or fire, but by the hand of those he enslaved, whose quiet vengeance struck him at his table. Though the pamphlet does not name the Whitmore family, the timing and location match. Folklore adds the color the archives stripped away. One tale claims the master collapsed face first into his plate, blood foaming at his mouth, his hand reaching out as though grasping for air. Another insists he staggered from the table, calling for his overseers, only to fall in the hallway, his voice silenced forever. Some say 2 overseers also fell sick that night, writhing on the floor as neighbors fled in fear. Whether all or only one died, the story was the same. Dinah and Lottie's vow had been fulfilled. But vengeance does not end in silence, it sets the world ablaze. As the household erupted in chaos, the sisters slipped away. In the confusion of screaming guests and rushing servants, they vanished into the night. Oral accounts insist they did not flee blindly. They knew the paths that wound into the Appalachian woods, trails whispered about in slave quarters, routes once used by runaways who vanished into the mountains. Some say they carried only a bundle of bread. Others that they bore a knife, blood still staining the blade. The Whitmore estate, shaken to its core, wasted no time in retaliation. A militia notice from June 1847 reads, "Two Negro women suspected of poisoning their master fled into the mountains. A reward of $200 each is offered for their return, dead or alive." This phrase, "dead or alive," is rare in such records, suggesting the depth of fear and rage that gripped the community. For two enslaved women to kill not only their master but to escape into the woods was more than crime, it was an earthquake to the order of slavery itself. From that night on, the sisters became phantoms. Some say they joined maroon communities hidden deep in the ridges, where other fugitives carved out survival far from white eyes. Others insist they crossed into free territory with the help of abolitionists, their names changed, their story buried to protect them. And still others claim they did not survive the manhunt, that they were caught and killed in silence, their bodies unmarked, their memory erased by fire and ledger. But what cannot be erased is the fact of the act itself. Too many fragments, too many whispers, too many silences that point to the same truth. On a warm night in 1847, two sisters who had endured loss, violation and separation, stood in their master's dining hall and turned servitude into justice. The act was not madness. It was not savagery. It was history breaking its silence. It was the human spirit, cornered and crushed, erupting in the only way left to it, through fire, blood, and flight. And as the Whitmore plantation tried to return to order, as overseers cracked their whips harder and neighbors whispered of curses, the shadow of that night lingered. For every enslaved person in Monroe County who heard the tale, whether in secret or in rumor, Dinah and Lottie's act was proof. Proof that silence could shatter. Proof that even in chains, resistance lived. Proof that history itself could be rewritten by two hands in a kitchen. Two voices that once prayed in silence, two sisters who chose to strike. The records may try to hide it. The newspapers may deny it. The court ledgers may vanish in fire. But the night itself remains, buried in folklore, scratched into memory, carried through generations in whispers. The sisters who killed their master and fled into the Appalachian woods. Rebellion in the South of 1847 was never allowed to stand unanswered. The very act of resistance by Dinah and Lottie sent shockwaves far beyond the Whitmore estate, because it did not merely take a life, it threatened the illusion of order that slaveholding society depended on. For in the South, it was not cotton or tobacco that kept masters awake at night. It was the fear that those they enslaved might rise, that centuries of silence might erupt into fire. And so, the aftermath of that spring night was written not in ledgers of justice, but in blood. Within hours of the master's collapse, chaos spread through the plantation. Overseers stormed the quarters, dragging men from their cabins, demanding answers, striking them down when no words came. Women were whipped, children threatened, elders beaten with rifle stocks. According to a militia report filed June 1847, at least a dozen Negroes were examined under lash for confession, none admitting knowledge. The word "examined" in such documents was a euphemism. What it meant was torture, whips tearing skin, ropes tightening around wrists, iron pressed to flesh, until the body broke or the voice surrendered. But still no one betrayed the sisters. Whether because none knew their plan or because silence itself had become its own rebellion, the enslaved community kept their secrets buried deeper than pain. Overseer Bell wrote in his diary that month, "They closed their mouths as though sewn. Not a word to be got from them." In the days that followed, militia riders scoured the Appalachian foothills. Notices were posted in Charleston, Staunton, and Lewisburg, offering $200 for the capture of two Negro women, Dinah and Lottie, suspected of poisoning their master and fleeing into the mountains. The description was cold and brief: one tall, scar on left cheek. One shorter, lighter in hue. No mention of their grief, their child lost, their brother sold. Only bodies catalogued as property gone missing. The community's response was immediate and merciless. To reassure frightened planters, punishment fell not only on those suspected but on those who remained. In an 1847 letter to the Richmond Enquirer, a planter's wife noted, "Several of the Whitmore Negroes were made example, flogged publicly before the courthouse steps." Oral histories expand on this with chilling detail. An elder interviewed in the 1930s recalled hearing that 3 men from the plantation, names lost, were hanged from a tree as warning to the rest. Their crime? Simply being there, being alive, being reminders of what the sisters had done. Public executions after slave resistance were not rare. In Virginia after Nat Turner's Rebellion of 1831, more than 50 enslaved people were killed, some with no evidence of involvement. The same logic ruled here: strike fear into every black body so that no ember of defiance might remain. The Whitmore plantation, once a site of quiet cruelty, became a theater of terror. The overseers turned the quarters into cages of suspicion. Every pot stirred, every song hummed, every silence held became grounds for punishment. And yet, the very ferocity of the retaliation betrays the depth of fear. If Dinah and Lottie had simply been caught and punished quietly, the matter could have been buried. But their escape, their vanishing into the mountains, left the white community shaken. 4 months afterward, newspapers in Charleston carried veiled references to unrest in the uplands. One small note in the Charleston Courier of July 1847 mentions, "Suspicion of Negro plot put down near Monroe. Vigilance urged among planters." Nowhere did it admit that women had struck the blow, for to name them would be to grant them power. Instead, silence was imposed even on the press. The malicious search stretched deep into the summer. Hunters with dogs combed ridges and hollows. Cabins of free blacks were raided, abolitionist sympathizers interrogated, mountain folk bribed to report strangers. But the sisters were never found. Whether they perished in the wilderness, whether they were hidden by maroon communities, or whether they crossed the long road to freedom will never be known. The lack of resolution only deepened white paranoia, for what they feared most was not death but defiance unpunished. Meanwhile, those who remained enslaved on Whitmore's land endured the full weight of revenge. Overseer Bell wrote on July 3, "Increased watch, no gatherings permitted, hymns forbidden." He banned night meetings, broke up prayer circles and silenced songs. But silence was already familiar to Dinah and Lottie's people. It was their shield, their language, their resistance. And though overseers wielded the whip harder, the story of that night spread in whispers. A boy, barely 10, was said to have carried the tale from one quarter to another, telling how the master fell face first into his food. A woman hummed a tune that disguised the words, "She served him supper, he served her pain, the night she broke the chain." Folklore scholars later collected fragments of such songs, though no melody survives. What remains is the memory of a community that turned vengeance into myth, myth into survival. The aftermath then was twofold. On the surface, it was blood, lash, and fire, planters tightening their grip, courts demanding vigilance, overseers patrolling with rifles. But beneath the surface, it was something else. Proof whispered from cabin to cabin that even the most powerful master could fall, that chains could be broken not by law or mercy but by the hands of the enslaved themselves. To white society, the Sisters' Act was a wound that had to be stitched shut by terror. To the enslaved community, it was a seed of defiance that no punishment could uproot. And so the aftermath, though drenched in blood, became also a beginning, the spreading of a story that history tried to erase but could never fully kill. But here, as we look back on those days of June and July 1847, one question rises like smoke from the ashes. Was the violence that followed truly meant to punish the guilty, or was it meant to silence the possibility of rebellion forever? The Whitmore plantation never recovered its reputation. Its fields bore crops, its overseers cracked whips, but neighbors whispered that the land was cursed, that the blood of that night stained every harvest. And still, the sisters' names lingered on the lips of those who dared whisper after dark. Dinah and Lottie, the ones who struck back, the ones who vanished, the ones whose silence turned to fire. There was no trial for Dinah and Lottie themselves, at least, none that has survived in the fragile ruins of court archives. They had vanished into the Appalachian woods, leaving behind a dead master, a plantation in fear, and a white community demanding answers. But someone had to stand before the judge, someone had to bear the weight of legal theater. And so, in the summer of 1847, the courthouse in Union, Monroe County, staged its proceeding. The surviving record is fragmentary. What remains is an 1847 court ledger, charred at its edges, preserved in part because it was copied into a clerk's notebook before the courthouse fire of 1891. The entry reads simply, "Hearing convened regarding the poisoning of Mr. Whitmore. Witnesses examined. Negroes implicated. No names are recorded. No full transcript survives." But from the formulaic phrasing and from comparisons to similar cases in Virginia and Louisiana, we can reconstruct what such a trial would have looked like. The courtroom would have been heavy with heat, its wooden benches lined with planters and overseers, the air thick with tobacco smoke and whispers. At the front sat the judge, a man not of impartial justice but of planter kinship, tasked less with discovering truth than with reassuring his peers that order could be restored. The enslaved men and women dragged in as witnesses did not stand freely, they stood in chains. Some were likely those already beaten in the aftermath, their wounds fresh beneath their torn shirts. Each was forced to answer questions they could not escape, their words shaped not by freedom but by fear. A clerk's note from June 1847, now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, hints at the atmosphere. Testimony of the Negroes conflicted, yet suspicion rests upon 2 women fled into the mountains. The clerk makes no effort to ask why their testimony conflicted. He does not record the silences, the hesitations, the eyes cast downward to avoid the overseer's stare. Instead, the trial unfolded as theater. A neighbor might have testified that he had dined with Whitmore that night and seen the sisters serving at table. An overseer might have claimed he noted strange behavior in the kitchen. The judge would have asked questions already heavy with answers, such as, "Is it not true the Negroes plotted against their master?" The clerk would write in careful hand. The Negro answered in the affirmative. Whether that answer came from truth, from a voice cracked by the lash, or from silence twisted into confession, the record does not care. This was the machinery of law in the slave South, a stage upon which the enslaved were never permitted to speak fully, but only to echo back the words demanded of them. Their humanity was absent from the parchment. Their pain was reduced to lines of ink. And their truth was buried beneath the weight of yes, sir, and no, sir written into court ledgers. In cases across Virginia, the language is almost identical. After the 1842 poisoning case in New Orleans, the court recorded, "Negro woman confessed to act, stated she had been compelled by others." After the 1835 plot in Charleston, the ledger notes, "Negroes implicated, names withheld." Always the same phrasing. Always the same erasure. The court did not seek to reveal, it sought to contain. And yet, if we listen closely to the gaps, to the contradictions, a different story emerges. Why, if the enslaved confessed, do no full testimonies survive? Why, if the sisters were truly condemned in absentia, was there no formal sentence recorded? Why do the militia records of that year speak of continued search, as though the trial had not resolved the matter? The silence itself suggests something the court could not write, that it did not truly have its culprits, and that the fear of their absence haunted the proceedings more than their supposed guilt. Folklore, meanwhile, tells us how the community remembered the trial. One oral tradition recalls that an elder woman brought into court spat on the floor and refused to speak. Another claims that when pressed under oath, a young man said only, "They gone where you can't catch 'em." These accounts may be embellished by time, but they capture the spirit missing from the ledgers, a defiance that no courtroom could fully silence. The trial in truth was less about law and more about ritual. It was the ritual of white authority reasserting itself. It was the ritual of writing guilt into ledgers, even when guilt could not be proven. It was the ritual of burning away the memory of resistance by turning it into criminality. By branding Dinah and Lottie not as grieving daughters, not as violated sisters, not as survivors of bondage, but as fugitives and poisoners. And yet, in that branding they achieved what no court could erase. Their names, even when cursed, survived. Their story, even when twisted, endured. The trial could not close the case, it could only perform an ending. But endings are fragile things, and silence has a way of echoing louder than words. When the court adjourned that summer, it entered into record a final line, "Matter unresolved. Suspects fled." Those 4 words, "suspects fled, matter unresolved," are among the most haunting in the archive. For they admit what the law could not control, that 2 enslaved women had struck at the very heart of the system, and that the system, for all its whips and chains and courts, had failed to capture them. But what, then, does it mean that no later trial, no later sentence, no later execution was ever recorded? It means that the sisters slipped into silence so complete that even the machinery of law could not grasp them. It means that their act became less a crime than a ghost, haunting the records with gaps and contradictions, refusing to be neatly resolved. And so the trial, in the words of the court, was not a trial at all but an erasure, a performance of power that revealed, in its silences, just how deeply that power feared the truth. History does not vanish by accident. When a story like this disappears, when records thin to fragments and testimonies dissolve into rumor, it is because someone, somewhere, wanted it gone. The case of Dinah and Lottie Whitmore, the enslaved sisters who poisoned their master and fled into the Appalachian woods, was not forgotten naturally. It was buried. And the burial itself tells us as much about the world of 1847 as the act of rebellion did. Let us return to the courthouse. In Union, Monroe County, the ledger that mentioned the sisters survives only because a clerk had the habit of copying entries into his own bound notebook at the end of each month. The original ledger is gone, destroyed when the courthouse burned in 1891. The fire was blamed on faulty lantern oil. But historians know a troubling pattern. Fires in courthouses across the South, almost always in counties with volatile slave histories, almost always erasing precisely the kind of cases that made planters uneasy. Fayette County 1850s, fire. Amherst County 1862, fire. Orleans Parish 1895, fire. Each blaze a convenient cleansing of the written past. What was lost in Union that day in 1891 was not just property deeds or tax rolls. It was testimony, names, voices already fragile. Among them, most likely, the full transcript of the sisters' trial. The destruction was physical. Paper turned to ash, but it was also symbolic. It was the final attempt to smother the memory of women who had defied the institution itself. But suppression did not begin with fire. It began with the pen. Newspapers, the loudest voices of the 19th century South, served as both judge and executioner of the public record. On June 22, 1847, the Charleston Courier ran a brief note. A disturbance in Monroe County, Virginia, has left one gentleman deceased. Negro mischief suspected. That was all. No names, no details, no acknowledgement that two women had struck a blow so deep it rattled the planter class. Weeks later, the Richmond Enquirer followed with a correction. Cause of death remains uncertain. Rumors of poisoning unfounded. The words unfounded and uncertain were not neutral. They were deliberate. They smoothed over the terror that planters whispered to one another, that their servants might be watching them across the supper table, that the food they ate might carry vengeance in every bite. The silences of the press are loud when placed beside the gossip they tried to contain. Diaries of neighboring planters reveal a different tone. One overseer wrote, "The women have gone into the mountains, none dare say more. My own cook, I fear, looks at me strangely." A planter's wife in Lewisburg confessed in her journal, "The story of the sisters has made the women bold. They whisper of it at washing." These were the voices that newspapers worked to drown out. Suppression also took subtler forms, words scratched out, names erased. In the Whitmore family Bible, preserved today in fragments at a private archive, there is a curious gap. A page where the master's death date should be recorded, torn clean away. Family Bibles were sacred records, meant to track births, marriages, deaths. To remove a page was not oversight, it was intention. Someone in that household chose not to remember, or perhaps chose not to let anyone else remember. Even abolitionist papers, which sometimes published lurid accounts of slave rebellions to stir northern outrage, remained strangely quiet on this case. The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's Boston paper, carried columns on the Amistad trial, on Nat Turner's rebellion, on poisonings in Louisiana, but nothing on Monroe County, nothing on Dinah and Lottie. Perhaps no correspondent dared to report it. Or perhaps the story was deemed too dangerous, even for those who sought to expose slavery's cruelties. For if enslaved women could plot and succeed in such vengeance, the fear it inspired might prove too explosive to print. And so, piece by piece the story dissolved. Records burned. Newspapers silenced. Names erased from Bibles. Whispers pressed into silence by overseers' threats. It is only through scraps that we can piece it together. The single ledger entry, the scattered planter diaries, the folklore that clung like smoke in the Appalachian hollows. But suppression is never perfect. It leaves seams, cracks, contradictions. In the archives of the Virginia militia, one finds a note from August 1847. Search for two Negro women fugitives in the Blue Ridge continues, though fruitless. Locals speak in hushed tones of their passage. That line, locals speak in hushed tones, reveals what suppression could not erase, that memory moved through mouths when it could no longer move through ink. This is the paradox of erasure. The more violently a story is scrubbed away, the more it clings to the edges of record, haunting the margins. The Whitmore case is a ghost in American history not because it lacked importance, but because it carried too much. It revealed too clearly that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active resistors. It showed too starkly that women, those least expected to wield violence, could strike blows that unsettled the foundations of slavery itself. And so, to protect the system, the story was smothered. But to smother is not to kill. The Appalachian would still remember. Descendants still whisper. And the fire that burned the courthouse could not burn away the dread that masters carried to their graves, that the kitchen might be the battlefield, that the women they claimed to own might be the ones who ended them. The suppression of the sisters' story was not simply an act of forgetting. It was an act of fear. And fear, unlike paper, does not burn. If the ledgers fell silent, if the newspapers lied, then how does the story of Dinah and Lottie still reach us now? How do we speak their names in the 21st century when the 19th century tried to grind them into ash? The answer lies not in the archives of law but in the fragile archives of memory, the whispered recollections, the campfire stories, the half-sung fragments of song that survived where paper did not. In the Appalachian foothills, where the sisters were last seen, memory does not always follow ink. It travels through voice, through oral traditions passed between generations, through the quiet warnings of grandmothers to daughters and grandsons. Among black communities scattered through Virginia and West Virginia, the tale of the two who ran into the mountains persisted, never quite the same in every telling, but always with the same beating heart. Two enslaved sisters, mistreated beyond endurance, turned their suffering into fire, and then vanished where no whip could follow. One version, collected in the 1930s by a Works Progress Administration interviewer in Greenbrier County, comes in the form of a lullaby. The elderly woman, herself born after emancipation, sang a fragment she claimed her grandmother used to hum. Don't eat the bread when the sisters pray. Don't drink the wine on a poisoned day. Run to the woods where the foxes hide. Run with the sisters to the mountainside. The interviewer dismissed it as nonsense verse. But to ears trained in the patterns of coded slave songs, it is a chilling piece of memory. Bread and wine at the master's table. Poison on a day of vengeance. Flight into the Appalachian night. The lullaby was not nonsense. It was archive. Other fragments survive in white memory too, though stripped of sympathy. In a 1902 folklore journal published in Richmond, a contributor records what he calls a curious local tale of the Whitmore estate. According to his account, locals in Union County spoke of a haint woman who wandered the forests at night, her face veiled, her hands stained dark. Hunters swore that if you followed her shadow, your rifle would jam, your fire would sputter out. The folklorist interprets this as nothing more than superstition. But again, hidden in the superstition is a trace of truth. A community trying to explain why the sisters were never caught, why their presence lingered in the woods long after they had disappeared. Folklore is rarely exact. It bends, twists, shifts with every retelling. But that is its strength. Where law seeks to fix a story into lines of ink that can be burned, folklore flows like water, adapting, surviving, slipping through the cracks of suppression. The tale of Dinah and Lottie became less a documented case than a ghost story, less a record than a warning. And in that transformation it survived. In black communities especially, the sisters became figures of quiet reverence. One oral account tells of a prayer circle in the late 1800s where an elder woman warned children, "Do not speak their names loud, for white folks don't forget. But remember them, always remember them." In the silence of that warning lies a powerful truth. Survival often depended not on shouting history but on carrying it quietly, like an ember cupped in the hand. We see this same silence in family Bibles where pages were missing, in names scratched out with ink. What appears to historians as erasure may also be strategy. To speak too openly of rebellion was dangerous in the Reconstruction years, when white terror groups prowled the South. But to whisper it within the family, to carry the story coded in song or prayer, allowed memory to live without drawing deadly attention. Even today, among descendants in Appalachia, faint echoes of the story survive. A family in Summers County recalls that their grandmother would never eat food cooked outside the home if she did not know the cook's bloodline. Another family tells of a carved wooden spoon, passed down with the story, "This is the kind they used when they served him." Such fragments may not prove the sisters' existence in the eyes of official history, but they prove something deeper, that the act of resistance left an imprint strong enough to ripple across centuries. The folklore also carried a warning for the oppressor. Planters told tales of servants slipping powders into coffee, of wives falling ill after eating cakes prepared in the kitchen. Most were superstition born of fear. But beneath the paranoia lay memory, the fear that what Dinah and Lottie had done could happen again. This fear became part of white folklore too, passed around as ghost stories of poison girls and witch cooks haunting plantations. Ironically, even in their attempts to demonize, they preserved the trace of truth. Enslaved women had power, and that power could terrify. What fascinates is how folklore preserved not just the act but the feeling of it. Official records stripped the sisters of humanity, calling them suspects, Negro mischief, fugitives. Folklore restored what the ledgers erased. It remembered them as daughters, as sisters, as women wronged, as agents of their own fate. Whether sung as lullaby, whispered as warning, or twisted into ghost tale, the sisters remained alive in memory because the people who needed them alive, the descendants of the enslaved, refused to let go. And here we see the power of folklore as counter-archive. Where the courthouse burned, folklore smoldered. Where the newspaper silenced, folklore sang. Where the Bible tore out a page, folklore wrote on the tongue. The story of the sisters may not appear in textbooks, but it lives in the spaces textbooks cannot touch, in song, in prayer, in firelight storytelling that outlasted the system that tried to erase them. Perhaps the most haunting part of this survival is the silence within families. Descendants often speak of gaps, moments when their grandparents refused to answer questions, moments when conversations fell still. One man interviewed in the 1970s recalled, "I asked my grandmother once why she never ate at a white man's table. She said only, 'Some tables you don't sit at. Some tables are cursed.' I didn't know what she meant until I heard about the sisters." In that silence, history breathes. It tells us that memory survived not only in words but in habits, in choices, in refusals passed down like heirlooms. The folklore of Dinah and Lottie is not neat. It is fractured, contradictory, haunted. But it exists, and that existence is victory. For every time their story is spoken, sung, or whispered, it undoes the suppression that tried to bury them. When we place the story of Dinah and Lottie in isolation, it seems singular, even extraordinary, two enslaved sisters striking at their master, then vanishing into the Appalachian night. But history teaches us that nothing in slavery was isolated. Every act of rebellion was part of a larger pattern, a subterranean current of resistance that flowed beneath the whip and chain, surfacing only when terror or courage made it visible. Dinah and Lottie did not stand alone. They stood in a lineage. Consider Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, a decade and a half before the Whitmore case. Turner, an enslaved preacher in Southampton County, Virginia, gathered followers and turned sermons into revolution. In a single night, they moved from house to house, killing nearly 60 white men, women, and children before being crushed by overwhelming force. Newspapers called it madness, a frenzy. Planters called it evil. But Turner's rebellion was not madness, it was memory. It was the embodiment of centuries of resistance, of whispers carried from Africa to Virginia. And Turner was not alone. In Louisiana between 1819 and 1840, historians have documented more than a dozen poisonings on plantations. Some were traced to Negro cooks, others to female servants, who slipped powders into stews and drinks. The records are always vague, the language evasive, but the pattern is unmistakable. Food, the most intimate connection between enslaved women and their masters, became a battlefield. Just as Dinah and Lottie wielded bread and wine as weapons, so too did countless unnamed women whose acts were scratched into ledgers as suspicious deaths. In South Carolina in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter, was accused of organizing what would have been the largest slave revolt in American history, thousands poised to rise in Charleston. The conspiracy was uncovered, dozens executed, Vesey himself hanged. Yet even in failure, his story fed into the network of memory, teaching the enslaved that rebellion was possible, that others dreamed of the same fire. The Whitmore sisters fit into this web. They were not an anomaly, they were another link. Their act, suppressed by newspapers, erased from ledgers, whispered in folklore, mirrors the acts of countless others who also struck back, whose names we will never know. What ties these resistances together is not only violence but silence. Almost every rebellion we can trace appears in fragments, in hostile accounts, in court records designed to condemn. We hear of poisonings not through confessions freely given, but through lines in overseer diaries, the cook suspected, disposed of quietly. We know of arson not through proud declarations, but through sheriff's notices of Negro girl executed for fire setting. These silences are the scars of a pattern too dangerous to write openly. And yet, when pieced together, they form a mosaic. Across Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, poison, fire, knife, flight. Each case suppressed as an isolated crime. Together, they reveal a movement that had no leaders, no central command, yet carried the same message. Slavery was not accepted. It was fought again and again by those forced to endure it. The Appalachian escape itself links to another pattern: flight into the wilderness. The mountains and swamps of the South became havens for fugitives. In the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, entire communities of runaways survived for decades, hidden among cypress and water. In the Florida Everglades, escaped slaves joined Seminole bands, creating maroon societies that fought U.S. troops in the Seminole Wars. In the Blue Ridge, where Dinah and Lottie disappeared, legends abound of cabins hidden deep in hollows, of lost settlements, where runaways carved new lives from secrecy. Even when no document ties the sisters to these maroon worlds, the folklore of their escape places them within that continuum. They did not simply vanish. They melted into a larger tradition of survival. For enslaved women, resistance often carried unique forms. Men might run or rise in armed rebellion, but women, bound to kitchens, laundries, and nurseries, found their weapons in proximity. A pinch of arsenic. A bitter root steeped too long. A fire kindled where it should not be. These were quiet acts, often invisible until they erupted in sickness or flame. And for every Dinah and Lottie whose story flickers into partial light, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose names never reached even the margins of record. The pattern terrifies because it is invisible until it isn't. Planters lived in constant dread of it. One planter in Mississippi confessed in a letter, "We are daily at their mercy. At any meal, our bread may be our grave." Another in Virginia warned his son, "Do not grow too familiar with the kitchen women. They hold the keys to our lives more than we hold the keys to their chains." Fear itself became part of the system. Fear policed, fear punished, fear suppressed. But fear also revealed truth, that the enslaved were never as passive as the law wished to imagine them. They resisted, again and again, sometimes openly, more often in whispers and shadows. The Whitmore sisters' story thus becomes more than a local tale. It is a thread in a vast, hidden fabric of rebellion. Their act of poisoning and flight into the Appalachians is not separate from Turner's uprising, Vesey's conspiracy, Louisiana's poisonings, the Swamp Maroons, the Seminole Wars. It is all one. One long refusal to be broken. And perhaps this is why their story was so carefully erased. To acknowledge it fully would be to admit not only that two women resisted, but that they were not alone, that resistance was everywhere, constant, uncontainable. To admit that would be to admit that slavery was never stable, never secure, never accepted. That it was always, from its first chain to its last, at war with those it tried to hold. And so the pattern becomes the true story. Dinah and Lottie were not anomalies. They were echoes. They were proof of what the South tried to hide, that beneath the silence an entire people fought back again and again, in ways history still struggles to name. When we place the story of Dinah and Lottie in isolation, it seems singular, even extraordinary, two enslaved sisters striking at their master, then vanishing into the Appalachian night. But history teaches us that nothing in slavery was isolated. Every act of rebellion was part of a larger pattern, a subterranean current of resistance that flowed beneath the whip and chain, surfacing only when terror or courage made it visible. Dinah and Lottie did not stand alone. They stood in a lineage. Consider Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, a decade and a half before the Whitmore case. Turner, an enslaved preacher in Southampton County, Virginia, gathered followers and turned sermons into revolution. In a single night, they moved from house to house, killing nearly 60 white men, women, and children before being crushed by overwhelming force. Newspapers called it madness, a frenzy. Planters called it evil. But Turner's rebellion was not madness, it was memory. It was the embodiment of centuries of resistance, of whispers carried from Africa to Virginia. And Turner was not alone. In Louisiana, between 1819 and 1840, historians have documented more than a dozen poisonings on plantations. Some were traced to Negro cooks, others to female servants, who slipped powders into stews and drinks. The records are always vague, the language evasive, but the pattern is unmistakable. Food, the most intimate connection between enslaved women and their masters, became a battlefield. Just as Dinah and Lottie wielded bread and wine as weapons, so too did countless unnamed women whose acts were scratched into ledgers as suspicious deaths. In South Carolina in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter, was accused of organizing what would have been the largest slave revolt in American history, thousands poised to rise in Charleston. The conspiracy was uncovered, dozens executed, Vesey himself hanged. Yet even in failure, his story fed into the network of memory, teaching the enslaved that rebellion was possible, that others dreamed of the same fire. The Whitmore sisters fit into this web. They were not an anomaly, they were another link. Their act, suppressed by newspapers, erased from ledgers, whispered in folklore, mirrors the acts of countless others who also struck back, whose names we will never know. What ties these resistances together is not only violence but silence. Almost every rebellion we can trace appears in fragments, in hostile accounts, in court records designed to condemn. We hear of poisonings not through confessions freely given, but through lines in overseer diaries, the cook suspected, disposed of quietly. We know of arson not through proud declarations, but through sheriff's notices of Negro girl executed for fire setting. These silences are the scars of a pattern too dangerous to write openly. And yet, when pieced together, they form a mosaic. Across Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, poison, fire, knife, flight. Each case suppressed as an isolated crime. Together they reveal a movement that had no leaders, no central command, yet carried the same message. Slavery was not accepted. It was fought again and again by those forced to endure it. The Appalachian escape itself links to another pattern: flight into the wilderness. The mountains and swamps of the South became havens for fugitives. In the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, entire communities of runaways survived for decades, hidden among cypress and water. In the Florida Everglades, escaped slaves joined Seminole bands, creating maroon societies that fought U.S. troops in the Seminole Wars. In the Blue Ridge, where Dinah and Lottie disappeared, legends abound of cabins hidden deep in hollows, of lost settlements, where runaways carved new lives from secrecy. Even when no document ties the sisters to these maroon worlds, the folklore of their escape places them within that continuum. They did not simply vanish. They melted into a larger tradition of survival. For enslaved women, resistance often carried unique forms. Men might run or rise in armed rebellion, but women, bound to kitchens, laundries, and nurseries, found their weapons in proximity. A pinch of arsenic. A bitter root steeped too long. A fire kindled where it should not be. These were quiet acts, often invisible until they erupted in sickness or flame. And for every Dinah and Lottie whose story flickers into partial light, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose names never reached even the margins of record. The pattern terrifies because it is invisible until it isn't. Planters lived in constant dread of it. One planter in Mississippi confessed in a letter, "We are daily at their mercy. At any meal, our bread may be our grave." Another in Virginia warned his son, "Do not grow too familiar with the kitchen women. They hold the keys to our lives more than we hold the keys to their chains." Fear itself became part of the system. Fear policed, fear punished, fear suppressed. But fear also revealed truth, that the enslaved were never as passive as the law wished to imagine them. They resisted, again and again, sometimes openly, more often in whispers and shadows. The Whitmore sisters' story thus becomes more than a local tale. It is a thread in a vast, hidden fabric of rebellion. Their act of poisoning and flight into the Appalachians is not separate from Turner's uprising, Vesey's conspiracy, Louisiana's poisonings, the Swamp Maroons, the Seminole Wars. It is all one. One long refusal to be broken. And perhaps this is why their story was so carefully erased. To acknowledge it fully would be to admit not only that two women resisted, but that they were not alone, that resistance was everywhere, constant, uncontainable. To admit that would be to admit that slavery was never stable, never secure, never accepted. That it was always, from its first chain to its last, at war with those it tried to hold. And so the pattern becomes the true story. Dinah and Lottie were not anomalies. They were echoes. They were proof of what the South tried to hide, that beneath the silence an entire people fought back again and again, in ways history still struggles to name.